years to realize you sort of have to be yourself. You can't be someone that you're not. Taking some of those things that you're learning is one thing, but trying to sound like someone that you're not it's not a recipe for long-term success.
Welcome to Breaking Barriers of Black Investors, the podcast that empowers and uplifts Black individuals with a passion for finance. Join us as we shatter the limitation and dive into the inspiring stories of successful Black investment professionals who have overcome the obstacles and achieved uncharted success in the asset management industry. Each episode, we uncover their journeys, strategies, and insight, providing you with the inspiration and motivation to break barriers in your own financial pursuit. Get ready to unleash your potential as we bring you captivating conversation with inspiring industry leaders. Subscribe to Breaking Barriers of Black Investors today to empower yourself for greatness. This is your host, Denard Michel, inviting you to join us as we break barriers, create opportunities, and empower the next generation of Black investors. Hello, Michael. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, sir. It's great to be here with you.
It's great to have you here. As I was actually thinking about creating my next episode, I wanted to make sure that, I had give you the opportunity to be one of my guests because you shared some valuable insight with me. And you mentioned that rather than focus on a specific niche, why don't you go ahead and broaden your scope? And I think from that advice, it really just kind of opened my eyes to the possibility of where I could actually take this podcast. Without further ado, I wanted to make sure that you were the next following guest in my episode. For those who don't know you, please introduce yourself.
Sure. So my full name, we were joking about this a few minutes ago, but my born name is Michele, but translation's Michael. Michael is one of those biblical names that every culture kind of has it pronounced a little differently. But my full name is Michael Andeberhan Agos Taqlidat Waldai Zarat Gabraba, which is a lot of generations that my father taught me when I was young and just kept instilled in like me and my siblings, just, know where we're from. But I was born in Eritrea, so that's a small country in East Africa. And today, June 20th is actually, we just passed Juneteenth yesterday, but today is actually Eritrean Martyrs Day, where we celebrate all of the sacrifices that our forefathers gave to give the country independence, which happened in 1991. So just a very important day in our culture. Celebrating both independence, but all the sacrifices from our uncles, grandfathers, fathers, and across the entire country. And for those of you that are not familiar with Eritrea, it's about 5 million people in East Africa on the Red Sea, and it gained independence from Ethiopia after about a 30-some-odd year civil war.
As I was actually preparing for this podcast and just reading a lot about the history of the culture of your country, Asmara, Eritrea is the country, but Asmara is the, I think you call it province, or is it like a same version of a state when you compare it to the United States? How would you describe Asmara?
Yeah, Asmara is so it's the capital, and then there's basically different regions of the country. So it's very dry in kind of the highlands where Asmara is based, and then when you get to the Red Sea, like Massawa, it's very low, it's very humid, and it can get pretty hot. But the country itself, it's not very large. I want to say it's maybe the size of North Carolina. It's not a huge country relative to other countries, which it borders Sudan, of course, is one of the largest countries in Africa. Ethiopia's also got a huge landmass.
But one thing that you actually have is that it's rich with culture. I looked at some of the food that you have, because right now, I was actually born in Haiti, and my last name is Michel. And sometimes you get, I hear people call me Michael, so I can relate what you're saying.
For sure.
But the food there, it looks very similar to what I have back home. Before we get started, I really want to ask you a question. What was it like growing up there? And can you describe your childhood in Asmara?
Yeah, so the culture definitely is rich in both tradition, dancing, food, music. You can actually see one of my mother's baskets as she wove by hand in the background there. And it's just, the culture itself is just very, very rich. And that's why we're such a proud people. But I actually left when I was 3 years old. So I mentioned the Civil War earlier. So that was going on until 1991. In the mid-'80s, my family immigrated, first crossing into Sudan, and then eventually crossing over to the United States. So I don't remember much, given that I was 3 years old, but I have had a chance to go back and visit family.
How often do you go back and visit?
So the last time I went was 2010, and I hope to go at the end of this year as well.
Well, I'm sure a lot has changed.
A lot's changed, yeah. Yeah, my parents go pretty often. My dad's retired, so he'll be going at the end of this year. And so I'd love to go back when he's there and see family and friends and visit my village. I was born in a small village called Adikolon, which is just on the outskirts of Asmara. And again, just wanted to be there and just experience. The country's still going through a lot of challenges, as a lot of African nations are, but still, it'd be great to go back and, experience it again.
When your family decided to come to the United States, did they go straight to Seattle or were they in a different location?
Yeah, no, we bounced around quite a bit. So we first landed in Vegas, of all places. So my younger sister was born in Vegas, and then we moved to Oakland, California, where my younger brother was born. And then again, we moved to a town called Bakersfield, which is about 2 hours north of LA. And we spent about 7 years there. My youngest sister was born there. And then we moved to Seattle in the mid-'90s. And Seattle it's a very rich Eritrean population. I think it's about 10,000 people that have moved to Seattle. I don't know if it's the rain or kind of the dry climate, but a lot of Eritreans have gravitated there, and then we've been there ever since.
I mean, so moving to all these different states and at home, there's obviously some differences in culture. Like, can you describe to me the differences that you experience in culture from the different states as well as what you experience at home?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest cultural difference, especially in a place like Bakersfield, where it's a small city, is there just wasn't that cultural richness. I mean, Bakersfield's 200,000 people, kind of in the middle of California. So the Eritrean community was very small. It's probably about 10 or 15 families. And then you get to Seattle and, it's a very large city, but to be around so many people that, spoke the language that I spoke, had the same interests, the same food, the same culture, was just it was like a night and day. And so for us, just having that experience and being around such a vibrant community was the biggest difference for us growing up.
By any chance, how many siblings do you have? And I wonder, the reason why I'm asking that question is because, you were lucky enough to have others that come from very similar background as you. Mm-hmm. But those that don't have that, they have to rely on their siblings.
Yep.
So do you have a big sibling base, or is it just you and your sister?
No, so it's 6 of us. So I am one of 6 children, and it's actually fairly evenly split. 3 of us were born back home, and then 3 of them were born in the U.S. And so having that, and it's 4 girls and 2 boys. So as you can imagine, having 4 sisters, you grow up pretty fast in that environment. And just growing up, having siblings just made a huge difference. You had people to lean on. My older sister, I almost say, even though we're only about 6 years apart, it's almost like she helped raise us.
With having an older sister and coming from a household of 6 siblings or 5 siblings, including you, were there some level of competition amongst you all?
Always. Competition for everything from attention to money to you name it. But it's almost like when you're growing up, all the things that you're competing for or fighting over, you recognize as adults. I mean, we were bickering as kids, and I got into a lot of fights and arguments with my siblings about all kinds of stuff. But now 3 of my siblings have 3 kids each, so now I have 9 nieces and nephews, and so the 6 of us became basically 15 plus my parents, so 17. So it's all those things that you grow up having because you're fighting for attention and everything. And being the oldest boy, there was a lot of pressure just to basically not screw up because in some of these communities that I was growing up in, people were dropping out of school or doing drugs and doing all kinds of stuff. And so just having that pressure to not fall into that trap was also big for me too. But, you compete for everything, but at the end of the day, as you grow up, you sort of appreciate those things.
Talk to me about some of the pressure that you face. I mean, I think that just being the oldest of the boys, there's a lot of responsibility in terms of you have to lead. Let's talk a little bit more about some of those pressure that you face, that you had to overcome to be where you are today.
Yeah, I think pressure, there's all kinds of pressure. I'd say one for me was just fitting in, and fitting in with different types of people. Try to fit in with my own people, try to fit in with people at school. And I would say I was never a bad kid, but I was more the follower. So if someone was egging me on to do something, I tended to kind of follow someone else's lead. And that can get you trapped in many cases. And, there was a couple experiences, one in particular that really kind of sticks out to me now. I was 14 years old and, my parents wouldn't buy me cologne. And, at 14, you got to smell fresh. The girls, they care about what you're wearing and how you smell. So I went with one of my friends to the store. We had no money, of course. And so we ended up stealing some cologne. And then he ended up going back and trying to steal some more stuff. Eventually he got caught, ratted me out. Long story short, my father and his father picked us up from the city jail. At 14, I'm freaked out, right? Because I've never been in a jail cell before. And they take us out. They kind of give us a little bit of a lecture. The police officer writes us up, kind of a juvie record, which gets expunged at 18. But the thing that stood out for me at that point was it was kind of like a crossroads. My father either could take one road where he just punished me the way he normally did, or he could actually be like much more present. So whenever I went to the library, he was there making sure that I was studying. He would, drop me off at school, pick me up, make sure I was actually going to class. And for me, that was like a huge difference because the person that I ended up stealing those colognes with, right now, he's doing about 30 years in the state pen for murder. So, I'm not saying that could have been my path, but it easily could have been if I just kind of strayed, continuing in that path. And so for me, like being able to have parents that were able to, know right from wrong, but also, parents are in a foreign country. They don't speak English. They're just doing the best they can. And, what they did to this day, I thank God because I could have easily gone in a different track. And that could have happened to a lot of young men. And so one of my passions today is like every time I work with someone who I can see myself, 10, 20 years before, really try to focus on, trying to make sure that they have that same path.
That is also scary, right? Knowing that, especially when you see, the guy that you did that with when you was a child and where he's at now, it's also scary to look back and see that could have been a possibility for me.
Absolutely.
Right? Especially at that age, going to a jail or just even a jail cell, that's a scary moment. So it's another interesting thing is just like how some events in your life and how parents' involvement could have a huge impact in terms of where you are today. So, and there's a lot of kids out there that don't have parents. If your dad and your parents was not around, do you truly believe that you would have possibly be in similar issue as him? Or if not similar issue, but pretty close to that?
Yeah, either pretty close, possibly similar issue. And the one thing that my dad did in that instance, because I was misbehaving before that, but I never got caught stealing. And so the typical punishment, especially for being an immigrant dad, is, to either get out the belt or, the typical spanking that I was just so used to. And so after I got caught, I was home and I was like assuming the position because I knew what was coming. And my father knew that obviously did not work because if I was in jail for stealing cologne, then his discipline up to that point did not work. And so he had to switch up his tactics. And what he did is he literally just took my favorite pair of shoes that I'd worked all summer for, $120, which when you're 14 years old, that's a lot of work to make that kind of money. And he took my favorite pairs of shoes and he cut them up with a big knife. And to see that happen to me, and then for him to warn me that, the next time it would be more than just shoes, was kind of the kick I needed to kind of get over what I was doing. And again, that could have easily been, I could have easily had a different path if I'd gotten the same punishment and he didn't supervise me as closely as he did, because I feel like at 14, again, that's when you're at that cusp where you can go in one direction. Because at 14, I don't think any 14-year-old is born to be, being a criminal or doing other things. Like, they have an option at that point, and it's just getting to that point where before they kind of go off track.
That is so true, because even when I was a kid, right, I was not the best kid. I was a good kid I really was a good kid at heart.
Yeah.
But, trouble just came to me, and I was one of those guys where if someone said something to me and I did not react, or I did not solve the problem right there and then, I had problems sleeping at night.
Yep.
Which it took me a while to overcome that. And I remember my dad, and I would say that my dad was a martial artist with the belt, right? So
oh, my dad too.
Like, he would literally hit you one time and hit you at 3 different spots.
Oh yeah.
So, but and the motivating factor for you was a shoe. But I think with me, it was more that my dad stopped whooping us and just started talking to us. And when he started to talk to us, I wanted the whooping so bad.
Yes.
Right? Because the talk, it has a lasting effect. The whooping is just pop, immediate, and you get it over with.
It's immediate,
but,
I wear like a couple layers. You're prepared for that. And the talking and the actual, like, he would go to the library and sit there while I'm doing homework, which is so embarrassing for a 14, 15-year-old to have your pops next to you reading like a magazine and just chilling. Cause he's like, he was like Secret Service. Like, yo, you're not coming anywhere near this guy, like he's on lockdown. So, and that worked. I mean, it worked. Yeah.
That's funny. So let's talk about your parents real quick. Cause I know that you didn't have much memories of you when you were in your hometown, your home country. What was some of the challenges that your parents face?
I mean, all kinds. They still have them to this day. I think the biggest was raising kids and, assimilating to a much different life. Like Eritrea versus like the U.S. is like, I mean, that's as night and day as it can get. My father was a soldier, and so he was used to kind of being in, such an advocate for, the country, and he still is, and, still fights for a lot of freedoms. But to go from that to being in the US, things like just getting a job, like not understanding English and just being able to work was a challenge. They were able to overcome that. My father retired from the University of Washington, where he's got a good pension, and my mother's about to retire from the university as well. And so they were able to overcome all that. But one rule that they always had when we were growing up, which again I appreciate to this day, is they never worked at the same time. Like, if my father was taking the day shift, my mom would take the night shift. My mom would work the day shift. My father would work the night shift. And it was really to ensure that there was always someone at home, because there were a lot of people we grew up with where their parents worked at the same time because they were trying to make ends meet. And when you have no supervision at home, I mean, that's a recipe for all kinds of things. And so that's one thing I remember very, very vividly, is that someone was always home. And I feel like that was a huge differentiator for us. And not just me, like my other siblings as well. It was really important for us to just have someone at home.
And there's a lot to unpack there, especially from, your dad background is really military, even though he retired from the university system. One thing about people who have a military background is that they're very much so disciplined, right? They move by principles and discipline around those principles. What were some of the principles that you had to ingrain in your mind that your dad instilled in you?
Yeah, I think first and foremost is like my dad was always, he was his big thing was always be on time, always keep your word. He's never paid a bill late in his life. Like just the little things of like being, committing to your word and making sure to execute on that. And his, in Eritrean culture, like a lot of times when someone meets me for the first time, they don't ask me, what my name is. They ask, who's your father? And then I tell them who my father is. And then all of a sudden the reaction is, oh, it's either embrace or it's like, friendliness. And for my father, like his name and his reputation was very, very paramount. And so for us, making sure that we always kind of maintained the family name and kept it in good standing was extremely important. And a lot of that was passed on to me. And then my brother, he's also was in the military as well. He served in Iraq as well. And just having that discipline from, that early, upbringing, especially for us boys, being raised by my father was extremely important. So just make sure that your word is your bond, make sure that, whatever you say you're going to do, that you're going to do. And, that's what you lean your reputation on.
That is a great principle to actually have. Your word is your bond, because a lot of people nowadays, they say a lot of things, but they don't really do it.
Yep.
Right. Or you have to make sure that you have that in contract, right? So, you said it, but I can't quite believe it until I see it on paper.
Absolutely.
It's almost as seemed, that's what the society is shifting towards. One of the things that was significant about what you said initially is that you have both parents in the process of retiring. There's a lot of parents that come to this country and they can't retire. And I'm sure that you were a big part of, if they ever needed some advice or in terms of like proper structure, pretty sure you probably, had the ability to help them out with that. But what does that mean to you to have both parents come to this country and have the ability to retire?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a reflection on their discipline. And I think, I'm proud of them for being able to, they raised 6 kids on nothing. I mean, when I say nothing, like to raise 6 kids on a combined income of under like $50,000 a year, like think about that today. Like that would be almost impossible. So there was never a moment where we didn't have what we needed. There were things that we wanted, but in terms of the needs that we had, there was never any doubt that we, could get by. So I think that's something they're proud of. But also more importantly, they raised 6 kids and all of us are educated. All of us are college educated. And, I feel like, again, going back to that name as your reputation, one of the things that my father, his reputation around the Seattle community is known for is just having kids who were able to go to college and be very close and tight knit. So I think that's probably a bigger accomplishment for them versus being able to retire. But then again, if they have six kids that can help support them through retirement, that also kind of makes things a bit easier.
Real quick, we hope you're enjoying the episode and your support would mean the world to us. If you found value in breaking barriers of Black investors, we kindly ask you to take a moment to rate and leave a review on your preferred podcast platform. Your feedback not only helps us improve, but also encourage others to join our empowering community. Thank you. Looking back at your childhood and all the things that you have shared with us, can you share with me any significant moment besides what your dad did that impacted your personal growth and development?
Yeah, I think probably the other big moment was actually when I was in undergrad. So I was not a great high school student. I mean, I basically just got by. It wasn't because I wasn't smart. I just didn't really apply myself. And so I barely got into Washington State University, which is where I went to undergrad. And then the first 2 years were like a struggle because, again, like that discipline of like not being in high school where like, people are waking you up to go to school and like having that kind of like layer of someone like looking out for you versus going to college. I was 4 hours away from home and I had to kind of just do things on my own. And the first 2 years I almost flunked out. And then I think what kind of got me through it was just finding kind of the right optimal roommate. So the roommates I had for a freshman and sophomore year were like a disaster. Like when I say a disaster, the first guy I lived with freshman year, he never finished school, and coincidentally, he's also behind bars for some other stuff that I won't get into. But like I found my ideal roommate junior year. Guy was like disciplined. He was Muslim. He didn't drink. And that's just like literally what I needed to kind of get back on track. So shout out to my boy Sheikh Kamara. He's from Mali, West Africa, and that was like a big change for me. And like that kind of got me on that similar kind of trajectory where I could have easily dropped out. And if I dropped out of college, then I can guarantee you I would not be here talking to you right now, because, once you do that, you got to earn money. And like, it's a path that for me, I knew wasn't going to work. So that was kind of like I think that was the other big crossroad for me, in addition to the whole incident about, getting caught stealing with cologne, because again, that could have been easily a path where I would have dropped out of school, but luckily I didn't. And, things kind of went well from there.
It seems like, environment plays a huge factor in terms of not only from a motivational standpoint, but also from a discipline standpoint. Just having the proper environment could really align you better for the future. When you actually started to be a better student, I'm curious to know, what career did you envision for yourself after college, and how did you prepare to make that happen?
Yeah, I didn't really envision anything other than what I enjoyed in school was I enjoyed finance because it was kind of a black and white world. Like if you get into philosophy or all these other things where everything is gray, it's kind of based on your interpretation. And with finance, like you can get to one number. So it's like mathematics, like you can get to one number and that's the response and that's the answer. And we actually took a class where we took real live money and invested it.
You mentioned that, financing was something that you pretty much understood. It was practically black and white for you. For me, to be quite honest with you, finance was not that black and white. For me, it was quite complicated and complex. Mm-hmm. Because I think that as a student, right, finance is so broad. And for you to really understand finance, there's so many different areas that you have to understand, like accounting and economics and the difference between stocks and bonds. What made finance so black and white for you? I'm curious.
Yeah, well, maybe to be clear, the reason I like finance is you could actually take real money and see it work. So the class that we took, we actually invested money. So it was less theoretical, but you can actually put money in the market and see it appreciate, versus accounting, where my head would explode trying to make a balance sheet balance. There was no way for me to get those numbers to match. So that's why I was never an accounting type of person, because I was super rigorous in terms of discipline and making sure that everything is exactly where it needs to be, versus finance, where you can directionally be in the right course and then see it play out. But for me, I think just seeing money go to work, and I didn't grow up with money. I didn't know what the stock market was until I was a junior in college. So being able to experience it and go on the computer and seeing a portfolio grow or fall. And so for me, I think that was the biggest change, is experiencing the real life action versus accounting. I used to clown accounting majors. I'm like, we're making all the decisions. You guys are just making sure that the books are balanced. So for me, seeing that actual work out was a huge difference.
I want to dive into your entry into the investment industry. How did you get started, and what were some of your barriers of entries?
Yeah, so the way I got started, so I did a year in grad school after undergrad, which, to this day I regret, because I think grad school is really designed to have some experience and then apply that in grad school, versus I went directly through. But I went through it. And then my first job out of school was working in wealth management for basically a lot of high net worth clients. And right away, I knew I didn't like that, because literally I had nothing in common with these people, nothing. Their problems were of the 1%. And for me, growing up with all these siblings, that was not, the challenges that I grew up with. So I did that for a year and a half just to make sure I got my feet wet, understood how to like make a lot of those things that you learn in school, apply it to the real world. And for me, that was the first entry, but I knew it wasn't like my career path. And so that was kind of the way I got into it. And the biggest barrier, again, was just kind of speaking the talk, talking the talk, because I didn't have that growing up. So a lot of my first, meetings, I was super nervous, like just making sure that I didn't sound like I didn't know what I was speaking about. And so that was the biggest barrier. But once I got my feet wet, I became a bit more comfortable. I was able to overcome that.
It's funny because you and I had very similar path. After graduating my undergrad, I've also worked at a wealth management firm. And for those who are listening that don't really understand what wealth management really is when you first started, it's simply sales, right? You thinking that you're going to come in, you're going to, do all this analysis and create all this, portfolios. And you realize that, hey, I don't really learn too much about stocks.
Not at all. I used to say it felt like I was more like, not want to say a therapist, but I was dealing with a lot of people who, a lot of them were frankly trust fund babies. And so they would come to me and talk about, my father wouldn't buy me this, or my grandfather wouldn't buy me this, because they were just waiting for this inheritance. And so it was less about finance and more like just being, a therapist to these people that are complaining about problems that I would never in my lifetime ever even dream about thinking about. And so it was less about kind of like what I was learning in school and more about, managing people. It was like managing people and managing their personalities. And, it's almost like I didn't get a psychology degree, but I became a bit of a psychologist in those first few years.
But on the contrary, that's actually a really good start, right? To really think about it as you start to move up the value chain in any corporation, right? You move away from technical skills to more soft skills. And I think that, and in the wealth management side, right, that soft skill, the ability to just take one client to move from point A to point B, and just having the confidence to talk to them despite the level of success that they have, it's great. But you mentioned that, the barriers of entry was, learning how to talk that talk, right, that language. I'm curious, how did you overcome that barrier?
How did I overcome it? I think I was trying to be an acute observer of kind of the more senior folks on the team. So I worked with 2 portfolio managers, and literally it would be like osmosis. Like when I'm at a meeting, I'm picking up words and trying to remember how to use those words in kind of a meeting setting. And so a lot of it was just literally kind of absorbing what others were doing and trying to emulate that. So it's almost like I was trying to emulate someone. And then it took me a lot of years to realize you sort of have to be yourself. You can't be someone that you're not. Taking some of those things that you're learning is one thing, but trying to sound like someone that you're not it's not a recipe for long-term success.
After wealth management, how did you get into consulting?
Yeah. So one of the things I realized in doing that wealth management job is like, I did not want to work with like really wealthy people. But there were a few clients where it was like an endowment, like a university endowment. There were a few clients where it was like a corporate pension fund. And the first thing I could do was like, I could tie that to my own experiences. So I got scholarships in college. I got Pell Grants. So I knew like what an endowment would do, which is basically fund scholarships. So I could tie that to my own experience. And then a pension fund I knew was something that, I would aspire to have a pension fund of my own, my parents eventually when they retire. So it was more about tying those parts of asset management to like what I could understand versus like someone whose, net worth is $5-10 million. Like that was not something I could relate to. And so consulting, Seattle's not a huge financial market. So there's a few consulting firms in town. I got an interview at a firm called Wirtz and Associates, and that's all they did. They worked with institutional investors, and I got my first interview there and, knocked it out of the park, and I was able to start there as an associate. And for me, that kind of like put me on the path to where I'm at today, because that experience and working with more sophisticated investors kind of helps you up your game a little bit. When you're talking to someone who doesn't really know finance and they just know that they've got a trust fund that's going to kick in a few years, it really changed kind of the trajectory for my career.
For those who are listening that don't understand our area of consulting, I mean, I think for most firms, unless it's a small boutique firms, they usually have a research side and you have one that's more of a client facing side.
That's right.
Starting up, were you more hybrid, or were you originally mostly focused on the research side and then eventually moved towards the client facing side?
Yeah, what I loved about that role when I first joined is I joined as a hybrid. So I was an associate where I basically worked with one of the senior consultants, and we worked directly with her clients. So that gave me the client interaction, kind of the one-on-one. But then she also had a role as head of research. And so one thing that she instilled in me when I first joined, and this is a piece of advice that I think I still carry to this day, which is she said, I'd much rather have you beg for forgiveness than ask for permission, which basically said, if you have an idea, unless it's like completely out of the sky and like it makes no sense, just run with it. And so she let me write research on things that I found interesting. And as a result, I was able to get them done, publish them, present them to clients. And so having that hybrid model for me at the start was super exciting because I could sort of pick my path versus pure consulting or pure research. You don't get as much kind of experience. And so I was able to do both.
With that much leeway, right, and just having the ability to really write or research things that are more interested to you and trying to figure out a way to present it to the client, and her giving you that level of autonomy, do you think that made you a good consultant or a great consultant? I mean, do you even think you were a great consultant?
I mean, I never thought I was a great consultant at the time because, I was still young. And it's funny, when you're a consultant, usually you're working with, in the case of a lot of clients, you're working with a board. And the board are very seasoned professionals. Some of them run hedge funds, private equity firms. Some of them are portfolio managers. And so almost all the case, even for me or even the senior folks that I worked with, they knew a lot more about markets than we did because they did it day to day. So it was never a case of, am I providing the best advice? Because consulting at the end of the day, it's advice. It's not, there's no crystal ball. I mean, if we knew what the crystal ball was, then I would be in Vegas right now because I wouldn't be working day to day if I knew what the markets were going to do every day. But I just tried to give the best advice I could. And I never felt like I was a great consultant because I always thought everyone knew more than I did. Mm-hmm. So it was more about just kind of keeping discipline.
So you say that you never consider yourself to be a great consultant, but I'm sure that you know what a great consultant look like. What are some of the skill sets do you think that separates a good consultant from a great consultant?
Yeah, I definitely, and I feel like I didn't feel like I was a great consultant at the time because I was still kind of learning the ropes. But my boss at the time, I knew she was a great consultant because what she was able to do in the span of an hour at a committee meeting is to actually get people to make decisions. Because ultimately that's the biggest challenge when you're a consultant is if you've got a private equity guy, a hedge fund guy, a fixed income guy, they all know their worlds perfectly well, but to get them to collectively make a decision on, say, an asset allocation, which is basically the allocation of different asset classes, it was really difficult because everyone sort of knew their area of expertise. And making a decision with that many smart people in a room is like herding cats. And she was able to get them to make a decision at almost every meeting. And to me, that's the sign of a great consultant is to get all these different opinions together and form at least one decision. And for my observation, that's the difference between a great consultant versus a good consultant, which a good consultant will get them to debate. And at the end of the meeting, you've literally made no progress from the start. And so that was the big differentiator. And shout out to Shelly Heyer, who was that boss of mine that really showed me the ropes.
That is awesome. Just having the ability to motivate someone or to come to a conclusion, I think that is a huge factor, especially in a leader. So let's transition to the next topic, talking about leadership. Do you think leaders are born or made?
I think they are made. I mean, there are some people that are just natural born leaders, but in most cases, I think the experiences that you have, kind of the hurdles that you overcome, are the things that lead you to become a leader. And I feel like every leader that I've observed in my career, in my life, did something to kind of get to that stage where they showed those leadership traits, whether it's overcoming things. I feel like the biggest leaders in my life have always been my parents and the things that they've overcome to become leaders. Professionally, it's always been folks that may have struggled early on in their career or just overcame the various challenges, whether it's being female, whether it's being Black, whether you're going through kind of the things that the challenges that you overcome in this profession, not being kind of a legacy, person that everyone expects to be in the room. One of the things that I heard growing up, which a lot of Black professionals do, is, being or sounding white, being told that you sound white, and, going back to speaking the talk and walking the walk. And I was very subconscious about that early on. But I realized that just means that, historically being in certain industries, there wasn't a lot of Black people in those industries. And so if you're sounding white, it's because you're sounding articulate and being able to talk about the things that are needed to be successful in that industry. And so that was something I was subconscious of early in my career. And now I could care less because that just shows kind of the naiveness of certain people in terms of what it takes to get into certain industries.
And the funny thing about it is just the mindset behind that, right? And, the belief that if you articulate a word properly, or you took the time, you have a proper grammar and punctuation and just the way that you sound, right? That means that you're speaking white. And I think that notion is just, I think it's just, not the best way to look at it, because it forces the youth to feel that, hey, you know what, I can't speak grammar. I got to speak based on, whatever town that I grew up in, if it's, slang or whatever, just so I could hold my identity, because I think the slang is my identity. So it's cool that you highlight that. Going back to the leader part, though, you said that, you believe that leaders are made. There are some born-made leaders. What type of leader do you think you are?
That's a good question. In terms of the type of leader I am, I feel like the leadership traits that I can exhibit is partly like showing people what not to do. So a lot of, if someone asks for advice, I don't say I have a crystal ball and I have the answers to everything, but I can say, here are the things that I did. Here's why I screwed up doing those things. And here's why I think that's not the best path forward. And I feel like when a leader can exhibit things in their own experiences in their own life that point to examples of where they went, not just right, but where they went wrong. I feel like any leader that says like they've never made a mistake or don't share those experiences where they screwed up and had to fix it or learn from experiences, I feel like that's not real leadership traits, because I don't really want to hear from someone who never had a struggle or never experienced those setbacks. And so for me, like, that's my leadership trait, is kind of leading by example and showing what not to do as opposed to the things that you should do, because I think those are generally understood. But the things that are the mistakes that are kind of in this path, I feel like those are the most important lessons for anyone to take.
So overall, what do you think makes a well-rounded leader? I know you mentioned that, learning from their mistakes, leaders are made. But if you have to look back at all the people that affected you in some way, from your dad, your parents, and some of your old bosses, and you had to combine some of the skill sets, like, what would you say would make a well-rounded leader? Yeah,
that's a great question. I definitely think I think empathy is important, not just for leaders, but that's just a good trait if you're like a well-rounded professional. So empathy, really understanding and taking people's challenges and, offering whatever sound advice you can. I think empathy is important. I think listening. Every leader that I've known that's a good leader doesn't think that their word is gospel, but they take bits and nuggets from all facets of life. Like the leaders that I see whenever I see interviews are always quoting someone else, whether it's a study or a CEO or some figure. And so leaders are learning from others, like they're always learning. In fact, most leaders say they read quite a few books a year just because they're always absorbing information. So I think empathy, always learning, always seeking advice. I think most leaders seek advice from others. They don't think that they know the answer to everything. And then I think lastly, just being humble. Like every leader, if you're a leader and you're a bit arrogant about it, I feel like that's not a great trait in a good leader. So being able to kind of share wisdom and also, show humbleness is super important. And I feel like those are the kind of main characteristics.
Thank you for sharing your insight of what makes a well-rounded leader. Let's talk about some of your involvement in various boards of nonprofit. But first, what was the process like for you choosing a board, and how does one go about joining a board?
Yeah, there's a few ways to join a board. And so my thought process, because board volunteering is ultimately like, your personal time. So you have to be really passionate about the topic. And one thing I learned about board involvement as I kind of progressed in my career is that, unfortunately, a lot of boards are actually, you have to pay to be on the board. So those are the more prestigious ones, but I felt like none of them kind of like hit what I was passionate about. And so what I look for in boards is something that I can relate to. So going back to my experiences growing up, like anything that, any board that targets, especially young Black men around that kind of vulnerable age between, say, 10 and 15 or 16, that targets that, I think is really important for me. So that's something I'm passionate about. Anything that targets like Eritrean youth. So I'm involved in this thing called the Eritrean Diaspora Network, where it's really kind of mobilizing Eritreans mostly in the U.S. That's something I'm passionate about as well. So if I can tie my personal experience to a board, then to me, that is the ultimate goal. Because, in many cases, like I mentioned, I could have gone off a different track. And so being able to tie that to my experience is super important. And then some of those other boards that I've joined on a volunteer basis, I do some stuff with the Defined Contribution Association. There's others where I like the people that run it and kind of passionate about the work. But if I can tie my own experiences to it, then to me, that's the ultimate sign that it's something I should be pursuing.
Even for myself, right? And this question was really, I guess, kind of like a selfish question on my, because I used to think that you had to have this massive amount of experience just so you could be in the board. And I didn't really understand the politics behind it, but also, the process behind selecting a board, because I thought that, okay, let me go ahead and find a board that's well known. Let me go ahead and choose it. Where I probably should have focused more on finding a board that really that aligns with my value. And to look at some of the boards that you're part of, and to just going back to some of your stories from your childhood, your grow up, your background, your beliefs, that alignment comes full circle. And I think I saw a couple posts from one of your boards, one of your nonprofit organization. I'm not sure. I'm probably going to butcher the name, but I think it's like Habesha Network.
Networks, yeah.
So, so it's pretty cool, right? I think that's really, really cool. That's going to lead me to my next question, because you have all this involvement in many different boards. It sounds like a thorough and strategic approach to selecting a board. Now, how do you balance your various commitment with multiple board seats, committee membership, and professional responsibilities? And how do you effectively contribute to the organization you're involved in?
Yeah, no, and back to your point earlier about, so Habesha networks. Habesha is a broad term that basically encompasses both Eritrean and Ethiopian communities. And, one of the things I was very strategic about it for my boards or the nonprofits I work with is like, I could care less about name brand. I could pursue kind of the big name brands, even these local CFA society things that maybe the cachet of the name would be important for someone, but that's literally the last thing I care about. If it's impacting my community or if it's impacting someone that I can kind of see myself in that, the target audience for that board, those are the biggest things. So that's one thing I always tell people. If you want to join a board, is like, make sure that you actually care about the cause and don't do it just because you want to get it on your resume or your CV. But I try to balance it by kind of not committing too much. I don't choose boards where I have to kind of do something like once a week or once every other week, because, it's a time commitment, and I don't want to be on a board and just kind of be passive. I want to make sure that I'm active and like supporting the cause. There's some boards that I really just do sporadically. So I do this thing with Wall Street Bound, which is, looking at high school folks that are bound for Wall Street that are, Black, Latino, underprivileged groups. And, that's not a huge time commitment. There was a group called Refugee Integration Insights where it's targeted refugees. And, I myself is a refugee. So, I have to tie it to something that I have a personal experience in, and then try to choose boards where I can both balance my professional day-to-day responsibilities with, the work that is encompassing the nonprofit. So it's making sure to balance the time, but also choose boards that I can wake up in the morning and feel like I'm making a difference and I'm passionate about, as opposed to kind of just checking it off the list.
When I look at Google, right, they say Habesha mean peace and unity between the, I could never say it. I'm probably gonna verse Ethiopia.
Ethiopia and Eritrea. Yeah, it's in the tongue.
Man, the accent always messing me up.
That's right.
But unity and peace. That's what online say. But what does that term mean for you?
So when I grew up, most of my childhood, Ethiopia and Eritrea were basically in conflict. So for a long time, even after independence in 1991, there was a lot of animosity up until the late 1990s, and then early 2000s, there was a small war that broke out. So for a long time, there was a lot of animosity between the two countries. And now in the last 10, 15 years, that's really changed. And now the border's open. There's actually flights between Addis Ababa and Asmara, which was the first time in forever. So to me, that group represents kind of unity between the two countries, but also unity amongst like our people. And like a lot of the events that that group has put together is really trying to bridge the gap, but also provide resources that, unique challenges that our community faces, just like Haitians have unique challenges that are faced from your community, and making sure that we're targeting that. So for me, it just means, building that bridge and making sure that we're providing the resources for our particular community needs and not just any community. So that's what it means for me.
With all the accomplishment that you've done, both professionally and then maybe perhaps personally, I want to figure a few things out with you. Outside your professional activity, like, what are you passionate about?
Yeah, I think my biggest passion is a lot of kind of what I mentioned, which is, what they say is like, no one kind of gets to where they're at without like a lot of, what's that term that I think it was Hillary Clinton that said, it's like, it takes a village. It's a very overused term, but in my case and in many people that are like me, like it literally took a village. And, I can't think but appreciate the village that got me to where I'm at. And then what I'm passionate about is making sure to just pay that forward. And if I'm not paying it forward and I'm just, kind of like resting on the things that I've done and will do, I feel like that's doing a disservice to my community, my parents, like my entire culture. So for me, that's what I'm most passionate about, is making sure that every opportunity that I've had, I provide, the same for someone else.
thank you for sharing that, Michael. Now I know I can't say the other name because it's pretty hard to pronounce. You told me it's okay for me to call you Michael.
Yeah.
So before we actually conclude our conversation, I have one final question for you. What legacy do you want to leave on this earth when it's all over?
Yeah, that is the $1 million question. My legacy that I want to leave. Because we're the first part of our family that were raised in the U.S., the legacy that I want to make sure that I keep is kind of like keep the family name in good standing and making sure that, my parents are proud of what I've been able to do. And then I pass that along, because one of the things I said at the very beginning is I said my full name through all the generations that I was taught. And so my kids are going to have my name added to that legacy. And it's really important for me, especially being the first generation that was raised in the U.S., to be able to kind of continue the name that my father and his father and so on and so forth have built. So that, I feel like, is the biggest thing I can do. It's not measured in dollars and cents and titles and all those things. It's really just being able to say that name continues to live on in sort of a proud way. So I feel like that's what I need to be remembered for.
Michael, thank you for sharing your story and insight with us today. And then also, it has been a great pleasure to have you on our podcast and just hearing your journey. I mean, it was, when I was doing the research and just, first of all, I didn't know the country. I'd never heard of it. I never met someone that introduced themselves like it. So, so just learning about your background and just having that moment to talk with you. And I appreciate your openness and willingness to discuss the important topics with us, some of your important topics. So please, thank you very much. We should definitely do this another time.
Most definitely, yo. And thanks for highlighting, people that look like us and sound like us. And I feel like this is what's missing, at least from what we see and hear in this industry. So just highlighting the stories, because again, everyone has a journey, and just sharing those differences and experiences, I feel like is super important, especially for anyone who's younger that's going to be listening to this.
Thank you, Michael.
All right. Thanks, brother.
Thank you for joining us on Breaking Barriers of Black Investors. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Your feedback fuels our mission to empower and uplift our community. Help us spread the word by sharing our podcast. Thank you for listening.